Welcome everyone to this showing of The Price We Pay, which is a film about tax havens, about corporate tax avoidance and inequality. In a little while, we're just going to watch the first 20 minutes of it, and then we've got a terrific lineup for a panel discussion, which will take another half an hour or so after that, and then you'll get an opportunity to watch the rest of the film. But I've been asked to say you'll have a little slip on your seat, which is about Resembly, and you may have used this before, but essentially if you can log into the Wi-Fi here, the OECD hotspot, and then follow the instructions, we're going to have a So to kick off this session, we're very lucky we've got Pascal Saint-Amand here, and he is in charge of the OECD Tax Policy Centre here, and he is a man who, with his team, are trying to fix all the problems that you're about to watch in this film. So, Pascal, if you set a scene for us.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good afternoon to you all. Quite exciting to be here to do the opening of broadcasting that really good documentary. I mean, when we were invited to watch it with the team, we were not doubtful because we know Brigitte Alpin, we know Harold Crook are great professionals, but it's so technical that we feared it would be, I mean, talking to us, but to nobody else. And actually what we've seen is that it reaches people on very complex issues. So that's the first time that our very technical international tax matters are explained to a very large audience in a brilliant manner. So I think it's very exciting. And I must confess, and you will see that they treated me so well that I can only say good things about the documentary, but you'll see that. Just a few words of introduction, and then we'll watch the first part, and then we'll have a panel. But we are obviously at a juncture in the international tax world. Since the crisis, and unfortunately it took a crisis to get there, the level of international cooperation, building up an international community with a common goal on tax matters, has become a reality. And this is what is happening. And the movie, I think, shows very well why it is happening, why this is a across-the-board issue, a bipartisan issue. You will see left-wing government, right-wing governments fighting for the same thing, which is more fairness. And in an environment where inequalities are rising, where a number of players actually can benefit from the loopholes of the lack of cooperation in the international tax system, that's extremely interesting. And I think that the movie also shows the way forward, what we are trying to achieve, and it's optimistic, which I think is extremely good. Very often, when we have observers, they are very good at describing a dark, gloomy situation with no solution. And then not only are you depressed, but you're hopeless leaving the room. With this movie, you can see that things are moving. And I think it's true. I mean, I'm in charge. I'm paid to say it's true, but I believe in that. It's true because if you look at exchange of information, I mean, the end of bank secrecy, it's here. We've done it. We just need to implement. There is a lot of work to do, and we need to keep fighting. But it's done. All the countries except Panama have committed to automatic exchange of information. Now, I may have the death threat from Panama for mentioning them, but that's life, I suppose. Second front, base erosion and profit shifting. You will see a number of prominent companies being accused of planning too aggressively. And they were extremely embarrassed in their response. We are fixing this by changing the rules, and not by being too populist, saying, well, I mean, bad guys and we should point to them, but actually they did plan in an environment where planning was not only authorized or allowed, but facilitated by the rules. We are changing the rules, the companies are changing. It may not appear here, and maybe that's the next movie, even though it would be too successful a story, but we do have Amazon having indicated 2 weeks ago that they're revising their tax planning, that they are dismantling their Luxembourg structure to declare permanent establishment everywhere. Starbucks has not communicated massively on that, and you see that they're in the movie, but they have changed quite significantly. And it's interesting if you track that in the press to see that they're back to normal. Normal being, you plan, it's fine, you reduce your tax burden, but marginally it shouldn't be the core of your business. The core of your business should be to provide good services and to deliver good goods. So that's what the movie is about. Very excited to see it again, and I look forward to the panel and the discussion we'll have then. Thanks for being here. Thanks.
Throughout the world, inequality is soaring to new heights. And the wealth of nations that once provided prosperity for the majority has gone missing. This is the story of powerful forces deepening the divide between the few and the many.
Does Apple Inc. own directly or indirectly AOI, AOE, and ASI?
Yes, Apple Inc. owns directly or indirectly AOI, AOE, and ASI.
AOI is incorporated in Ireland, is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it is incorporated in Ireland.
And where is AOI a tax resident?
It does not have a tax residency.
We tend to imagine that the fiscal state has existed forever. We look at a political map in particular, we see those flat areas of colour with little black lines around them, and that's Britain or that's France, and we think that's existed for all time. And that linked to that territory is an economy, and that's the fiscal state. Within that territory we raise taxes, we distribute welfare, and we understand how that works. But of course it hasn't existed for all time. There was a period before we had a welfare state. We had the welfare state under a certain set of conditions, and those conditions have changed.
For me, the history of the liberal state is the history of the middle class. You see, the middle class and those prosperous working classes that become this modest middle class, they were the big winners. It was their state. The elites didn't really need it. They needed a bit. They used it a bit. This was another world then. Huh? It was really a different epoch. The golden decades of the liberal state, which is also the welfare state, I think they're gone, they're finished. This liberal state is in decay. So here these middle classes revolting, the sons and daughters really, it's like a fourth or fifth generation after World War II, which suddenly finds this social contract is broken.
Il est surprenant que 225 ans après la Révolution française, nous revenions au point de départ où il existe une classe importante de la société qui profite de privilèges fiscaux. La grande noblesse de l'époque ne payait pas d'impôts et aujourd'hui, nous voyons effectivement renaître une nouvelle grande noblesse qui, légalement, ne paie plus sa juste part d'impôts. À l'époque, tout le fardeau fiscal reposait sur le tiers-État. Et aujourd'hui, comme mère, je crains que nous soyons en train de préparer ce même destin pour nos enfants.
Until our study in 2012, there was no systematic estimate for the size and growth of private wealth held through offshore havens. The global total was astronomical. It was 21 to 32 trillion as of year-end 2010, and it has continued to grow since then. You know, we're talking about 10 to 15% of the world's financial wealth basically being invested offshore beyond the reach of tax authorities.
Tax Justice Network is, and I mean, I know the guys who run it. They're fascinating people. I think they're misguided, but they're fascinating, and they're very well intentioned in terms of they really believe in this stuff. But they're not, Tax Justice Network doesn't have a huge staff of trained economists like the OECD or the IMF.
And I put the question to the former deputy director of the IMF just last year. You've got 3,000 economists between the World Bank and the IMF. I can't find any literature on tax havens. Why is that? He said, you know, it's very simple. Several of the most important tax havens are our members.
To understand the relationship between the City of London and the metropolis of London, you need to understand a little bit of the history. When William I came to Britain from Normandy, the French king, to conquer the rest of the country, he stopped at the gate of the City of London. He never finished the job. The French never finished the job. And the city maintained the rights and privileges that had existed in King Edward's day.
Many of the things the monarch gave us protected us, so we could restrict trade to whoever we wanted to. I mean, today you would actually probably be in a court defending it as a cartel or something, but that was the way it was, of course. We own all the bridges across the Thames, though over the years, from taking tolls over the bridges, we've built up quite a substantial amount of money there, which we use for the benefit of the nation. But one of the primary is to promote the London's financial services on a global basis.
The square mile of the City of London retains all the ancient rights and privileges and resources of the ancient City of London, and that the people who live outside the square mile, those 8 million, of which I'm one, don't share in those resources, although we are citizens of London.
Yeah, so this is the city. We use this for planning, showing that it's interactive. You can find out where you want to be. So we own about 25% of the city, the corporation. But I say there's now more foreign investors own the city than domestic.
And that what you have today, you have this institution that promotes the singlest interest of finance capital. It's using this huge network of resources to promote the single issue of finance capital. It's a travesty of its history.
we do produce an awful lot of money. What's good for the city is good for the country, providing that money is earned fairly and squarely and doesn't jeopardise the wealth of the nation, which it has done. So, you know. Nobody, in my view, has the right to pitch the tent on a public highway and stay there and decide and tell the authorities when they might wish to leave. And I went there because at that time I felt there was nobody putting up the case. They wanted to abolish the city corporation and everything else. I thought, well, I'll go there and I'll try and have a debate. The financial services industry, it produces about 65 billion in taxes, 35 billion in overseas surplus. It's been very successful because, apart from anything else, many of the other industries, of course, that used to be very successful in Britain have withered away. And I don't make any apologies for being successful. I don't make any apologies for being #1 in the world.
So far from being a success story, I regard the City of London as the world's biggest tax haven, attracting billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of wealth out of Africa, out of Asia, out of Latin America, out of Europe, out of Greece, out of Italy, to where it's misused by the City of London. Stuart, I would welcome it if quite a few of our bankers left as quickly as possible.
More or less a half of the whole global offshore system is in some way British, particularly the Crown dependencies and overseas territories. And these are, in a sense, fragments of the British Empire. After the Second World War, particularly, you had a very rapid phase of decolonization of, the British Empire effectively collapsed. And just at that moment, you had the birth of a new market in London, the so-called Euro markets or Eurodollar markets, which was essentially an unregulated market for dollars.
When the Bank of England made a decision to allow dollars to be traded outside of the Federal Reserve, because of a quirk of British law, it didn't have to define where it was to be traded. All that mattered was that it was no longer to be traded through the New York banking system. By not defining where trades were to take place, effectively it meant that the trades were taking place, depending on how you understand it, anywhere or nowhere.
The Bank of England basically deemed this transaction as if they don't take place in London. But since they don't take place in London, then London doesn't regulate this transaction. But then nobody else can regulate this transaction because it actually takes place in London. The result is they created an offshore market, which is unregulated. By the 1960s, the large American banks grasped and began to understand that actually by operating through London, they can avoid all sorts of regulation. And the market exploded.
C'est la première fois que des banquiers géraient aussi massivement de la liquidité libellée dans une devise qui n'était pas celle de leur pays. Depuis Londres, ce qu'on a fait, c'est qu'on a en quelque sorte réparti cette manne, hein, ces milliards de dollars américains-là qui ne relevaient plus du gouvernement américain dans différents paradis fiscaux, dont notamment les Caïmans, l'île Jersey, ainsi de suite. Bon. Donc, on s'est retrouvé face à ce qu'on a appelé la planète financière. Hein. Cette planète financière, c'est-à-dire ces gestionnaires de capitaux, ces titulaires de capitaux capables d'agir à l'échelle internationale sans être encadrés par quelque législation que ce soit.
The poor Canadian banks also wanted to take advantage of London, but London is expensive. And somebody hit on the idea, I don't know whom, but it was somebody in the Bank of Nova Scotia, for what I understand, hit on the idea that in fact, because Cayman Island is part of the is a dependency of the British state, it's subject to the same law as London.
On a dans les années 60 Donald Fleming qui, pour le compte de la Scotiabank, travaille à élaborer des lois en matière fiscale pour les Bahamas. Le ministre des Finances et du Tourisme est en même temps membre du conseil d'administration de la Banque royale du Canada. Et un peu plus tard, aux îles Caïmans, on a en Jim McDonald, un avocat d'affaires proche du Parti conservateur, qui lui conseille les Caïmans pour qu'ils blindent le secret bancaire en vigueur chez eux.
It has been said by an English jurist that it's the right of every Englishman to so arrange his affairs that the tax department doesn't put the largest possible shovel into his stores. And I agree with that. And in Calgary, I was fortunate enough that the income tax I was paying exceeded 50%. I was working very hard, long hours. I wasn't seeing my family. And I just essentially refused to pay more than half of my income to government. And so I started looking for someplace else. There's nothing, to my mind, improper, immoral, or anything else about establishing a tax haven. I don't feel any remorse about not paying taxes. I think it's a marvelous way of life.
Donc, on a en le Canada un pays qui est tout à fait engagé dans la transformation des législations britanniques des Caraïbes en paradis fiscaux. Sera efficace, moderne, adapté à la finance mondiale.
The Bahamas started life as a UK OFC, but it became independent in the 1970s. Bermuda is still an overseas territory. The Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Jersey, the Isle of Man, Guernsey.
So you had this kind of two-stage replacement for the empire. The city was suddenly reinvigorated and it started growing very fast again. And all these countries that had decolonized, as well as many others, because they still looked to the mother country for sort of the rule of law and, you know, financial trading, the money started coming back through this system, through the city, through the euro markets, and through the tax havens. And that mixed up with money from you know, presidents and their families and their cronies looting their countries, and all that money washed into the system. And all the players in the system very quickly realized that, you know, the more questions we ask about the origin of this money, the less money we're going to get. So, you know, very quickly this mentality developed that, you know, this ask no questions mentality, we just like the money.
Means is that money effectively crosses the border in one direction only. It leaves the country that issued it, the country that guarantees it, and it enters this global financial space, this space of money. It isn't a real space. You can't visit it. We can't get on a bus and go there, but your money can, and your money can travel the world through these markets without landing anywhere, and it can do so in perpetuity, should you so wish. And so the space of money, it's quite hard to conceive of a space of money. Imagine a bit like cloud computing. We call it the cloud because we think of it as hovering above us and carrying all our data in a way that's quite comfortable. We kind of like the idea of the cloud. Offshore finance created cloud money long before we had cloud computing. offshore is about leaving legal space. And so for that reason, offshore resides on the other side of the map, as it were. You can penetrate through the map into this rather undefined domain that we call offshore. We use this familiar topographical language as though it was simply somewhere else on the surface of the Earth. But of course, it's somewhere else legally, somewhere else fiscally.
Hello, I hope you all enjoyed that. We will get a chance to watch the rest of it in about half an hour. My name's Vanessa Holder. I'm a journalist on the Financial Times. And we have here a really terrifically high-powered panel to discuss some of the themes in this film. Starting left, we have Howard Crooks, who's the director of the film. We have Claire Fahrenbach, who is head of Oxfam France, director of Oxfam France. Then we have Rosa Pavanelli, head of the Public Services Union, the PSI. And on my right, we're very lucky to have Minister Cardenas, who is the finance minister of Colombia. And on the far right, Brigitte Alapin. And Brigitte co-wrote the film, and she also wrote the book which inspired the film. So to kick off, I wondered if I could ask you, Minister, what your response is to the themes that you've just seen raised. Why does this issue of tax havens, why is it relevant for you?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me in this panel, and thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to continue watching the documentary because it touches on a crucial issue for countries like Colombia. Tax havens at one point were portrayed as a solution and then a problem to high-income countries. And you see the G20, for example, previously the G7 and the G8, promoting the idea of dismantling tax havens. But in today's world, tax havens are becoming increasingly an obstacle for the development of countries, middle-income countries like Colombia. The number of transactions that are done through tax havens, the taxes that are not paid in countries like ours are a major constraint to what a government should do in terms of the provision of public goods, providing welfare, redistribution, because let's keep in mind that those that use tax havens are normally the better off, people that have the ability to hire good lawyers, experts, consultants. So tax havens really are constrained on the role of the state to redistribute. And this is particularly problematic in countries that have high inequality, like Colombia. So this is a major, major issue. That's why we have endorsed so enthusiastically the BEPS initiative here at the OECD. And not just that, the convention that allows for the exchange of information among countries. And very particular, and I'll end with this. We just signed a couple of weeks ago the intergovernmental agreement between Colombia and the United States that will provide every year, without any request, just in an automatic fashion, the exchange of tax information on For example, bank accounts owned by Colombian nationals in the United States and vice versa, bank accounts and owned by US nationals in Colombia. That exchange of information alone and the fact that it's automatic, that it's something practical, that is in operation, is fundamental for fighting tax evasion. So I hope other countries will follow this example. And the convention, the OECD convention, when it reaches that practical stage, will also be very useful to fight tax evasion and especially to fight tax havens. Because one distinguishing factor of tax havens is that they don't want to cooperate on the exchange of information. That's really what differentiates countries. And the more we do this cooperation, the more we exchange information, the more isolated will feel countries that do not want to cooperate and supply that information, and the more they'll have to be treated as tax havens.
Thank you very much indeed. And just before we move on to Rosa, I was going to ask you to comment next. I just wanted to say that one or two of our contributions will be in French. So if you need translation, there will be headphones in the auditorium. Rosa, you're representing a union. Some people here might not think it's obvious why a union should be interested in these issues. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say that it is for union and workers natural to be involved and interested in tax issues. I want first of all to thank, because it has been a long time without a public debate on tax, and so it's very welcome from us. It's very welcome because after the crisis we saw that many solutions to economic recovery, to boosting growth and economic growth have been tried in many ways. Unfortunately, we have to say that after 7 years from the crisis, we are confronted as workers and union to an increase of inequality, an increase of unemployment, and a reduction of public services because of cuts in public spendings that are one of the ways to redistribute wealth along with decent wages and tax system. So we need resources to boost the economy. We need resources for economic recovery. We need resources for re-establish a minimum of fairness and justice in our world. People is angry. People is angry when they saw that their rights are going down and down. There is a race to the bottom that is driven by multinationals. They don't want to pay tax. So tax havens are a point, but tax avoidance is also another issue that we need to tackle in order to reinstate equality and fairness in our society.
Thank you very much. And Claire, the same sort of question really. I know how big an issue this is for development charities like Oxfam, but I suspect a lot of people don't and maybe won't see the link. Can you explain a bit why it's such an important issue from your perspective?
Yes, and I will make my answer in French. Effectivement.
Well, yes, for organizations which work in development, one of the main issues is how to fund development. And we're talking billions of dollars which are not invested in public services and which stay either in tax havens or within corporations and in the hands of rich people who manage to avoid paying tax. So when you broach all these issues of tax avoidance and the arrangements companies can make with states, it is a true loss for public services, especially in the area of development. And this is something which also harms democracy. Indeed, trust is broken. What should be redistributed by government for the population that elected government is also disrupted, and very soon 1% of the richest population will own as much as the rest of the population. And this has an enormous impact on development, reducing poverty and growth. So it is very important.
And Harold, like Brigitte, will be here at the end, so we can ask him more questions. So just briefly, Harold, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what inspired this film.
Well, what inspired the film was Brigitte Alpin is a widely respected fiscal expert in Quebec and in Canada, and she's written a number of books on the crisis facing public finances, and she felt that maybe her concerns about the sustainability of public finances might reach a larger audience if a film was made about it. And I had just finished a documentary, Surviving Progress, which was about the sustainability of civilization itself. We won't go into that right now, but so between Brigitte's concerns about the sustainability of public finances and my previous film on the ecological sustainability of civilization, we met around the issue of the sustainability of democracy itself, insofar as the issue of tax avoidance is concerned. So that was the beginning of the project.
Excellent. Which sort of begs the question, what got you, Brigitte, first focused on this question?
I've been writing books about this issue for many years, as Harold explained briefly, and I felt there's a link that people had to understand between fair share of tax and democracy, a very important link. And I was trying to write it in books, giving interviews about it, and when you give interviews, it's only a few minutes, so it's something difficult to really explain. So I felt that I had to convince Harold to do a movie on this issue. So so that was really the beginning of this project, trying to explain in a movie that people will be stuck in the theater until the end of the movie and really capture the essence of the problem.
Excellent, thank you. The Minister talked a little bit about solutions to this, and in just a little while we're going to do a poll and ask you how far you think the suggested solutions are going to solve these problems. So just to fill in a bit, there is a big initiative on exchange of information on tax havens, which has meant that almost every country around the world, with some notable exceptions like Panama, have signed up and agreed to exchange information. And on corporate tax avoidance, the OECD is engaged in a massively complex and massively ambitious attempt to close loopholes. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn whether they think this work by the OECD, whether it's going to go far enough to level the playing field. And as I said, in a little while, 5-10 minutes, we'll actually ask what you think. So starting, Minister, would you be happy to expand a bit on what you said previously and perhaps bring in the question of corporate tax avoidance?
Sure. Well, let me make first a comment about awareness. I think it is very important that documentaries like this inform the public opinion about this problem. The issue of tax havens tends to be a niche issue. It's something that is the concern of governments, and it's also, I guess, the concern of organizations such as like the OECD. but it's not the concern of the average man or woman in the street. And I don't think we've reached the point where we can communicate in a clear way what the impact of all this is for the living standards of the population at large. And what's at stake is too much. That's why I think documentaries like this are so important, because people have to realize one of two things. They either are paying too much taxes because someone else is not paying them, or they're not getting enough benefits from the government because the governments are constrained fiscally because they don't have access to this tax evasion that goes to tax havens. So either way is not good for people. It's something that restricts the living standards of the population. So that's why the fighting against tax havens is so important. But then we need the support of the people. We need the support of the electorate, because sometimes these are difficult political decisions. There are many interests involved. So that's why it's so important to create awareness, and that's why a documentary like this is good news.
Thank you. And then, Brigitte, Pascal described your film as optimistic, and I wondered whether you would agree with that. Do you think that we have in sight the solutions to these problems?
Yeah, I hope. I'm happy. I was happy to hear that Pascal said the film is optimistic, because really we wanted to have a positive message at the end of the film. We didn't want a film that that would be a nightmare, or that people will leave the theater being discouraged about this situation, because if we cannot solve this problem, then we should fear fiscal crisis, and fiscal crisis can be very severe. History proves us that the fiscal crisis can it can be, it's something we should not we should pay attention to we don't want this. So we really wanted the movie to be to end in a positive note. Even I feel that even the music at the end of the movie is somehow inspiring. So so of course in an hour and a half movie we could not present all the solutions. You will see that we addressed a few one. We presented through one solution that is presented in the movie how it is not difficult to solve this problem. So. But I really feel that the OECD is doing a good. It's not because we are the OECD that I'm saying that. It's really, I really feel they're doing a great job. The BEPS project is the first important step through adapting our tax system to the 21st century, and I'm really supportive of the leadership of the OECD in this problem with our tax system.
Thank you. Rosa, I think you've said that you would like the reforms to go further.
Well, yes. I want to acknowledge the effort of the OECD and the BEPS program that has been very much welcomed by Union, and we try to bring our contribution to this program. So no doubt that this is a very important step in the right direction. Although I think that the dimension of the problem is so huge and really global, that involve not only the OECD countries. We need to think, for instance, that we need to find a mechanism to involve developing countries in order to have, for them to have a voice in this problem, given that they are so much affected by the issue, by the role of multinational corporation penetrating their market and bringing their activities in their countries. We think that we need to find the courage to address also another issue. And this is the fact that multinational, where they pay tax as different entities in different countries. Maybe it's time to think that multinational are a unique entity, acting globally, working globally, and so we need to think how to address this issue as well. Of course, we think that a very important step should be the enforcement of the BEPS. That also question mark how we enforce this program. The country by country reporting is something that we absolutely need. And of course, respecting the Convention against bank secrecy is another fundamental issue that we think need to be addressed.
Thank you. And Claire, what would your view be on, will we have a level playing field after these reforms have gone through?
Oui, alors, je rebondis.
Yes, I'd like to go back to what has been said about the need to work on reforming the tax system. This system has to be international, and developing countries must be involved. Maybe one country, one vote, because some non-OECD countries were called, I think there were only 14 of them, were called to participate. And multinationals have participated a lot in this debate, and the major stakeholders in this reform were called upon to participate. So there was an imbalance in this debate to the benefit of those for which we would like to have an impact in adopting this project. And the timing was also very tight for a reform of that scope. So we have to allow for time to discuss and solve the different issues. We also have the rebalancing of tax reform between the source country and other countries. We also notice that all sectors are not covered, like extractive industries, for instance. They're not involved. When you're speaking about developing countries, you know that there is a lot of extractive industries in those countries, and they were not involved in this debate. That is quite surprising. We also speak at the level of country per country reporting. I think there is a threshold, an amount above which there should be reporting.
In our assembly poll, so if you're logged into it, you've got a yes or no answer, and the question is, will the BEPS projects and current government commitments go far enough to ensure a level playing field in the international tax system? And just when we've got some replies into that, we can get going on Q&A. But meanwhile, on this system, I've had a question come in. Somebody wants to know what the panel thinks about Delaware as a tax haven. And it picks up on one of the points in the film we saw was the comment, I think it was the IMF or the World Bank, said that a lot of the countries, its members, it would classify as tax havens. So I wondered if anyone who would like to comment. Brigitte, is one for you?
Yeah, I think it's an important question to show that when we speak about tax haven, sometimes we think about Ireland and, Bahamas, Cayman Islands, Jersey. And with deglobalization, it's important to know that finally, all the countries can become a tax haven, or part of the country can become a tax haven, like Delaware. Bloomberg did a study in 2010 saying that the most important tax haven is Delaware. So we should not, we should adapt our way of thinking about tax haven, and maybe think more about tax competition, the fact that countries might use tax to attract capital, and Delaware is one of the probably most important example in that sense.
Thank you. Interesting point, particularly about tax competition being perhaps where this debate is going next. As well as perhaps asking the rest of the panel to, if they'd like to comment on that, I've got another comment here from a member of the audience. I felt pretty powerless getting out of the theatre after watching The Price We Pay. As individuals, what can we do? And that's an interesting point. Rosa, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think that as individual, I think that the first thing that we have to do is to try to learn how the mechanism work and try to spread the information, because it's raising awareness that can make people pay attention to these very complicated issues. It's not easy to understand. Second, I think that as individuals, we need to regard the politicians that are supporting the idea of create tax havens and tax competition among countries, or giving incentives to multinational through tax exemption to invest their countries as complicit in tax evasion. I think this should be something that is important as individual to do. It's a political matter, this issue of tax, and it relates to the future of our society and of our countries. I don't think that we can postpone a serious decision about that unless we decide that the principle of our democracies are put at stake, and we don't care about that.
Thank you. Now, in the audience, is there anybody who would like to make a contribution or a short question? I stress short because unfortunately we're very short of time, but it'd be great to hear from people if they would like to comment. So now, meanwhile, why don't we go back and ask Claire, do you have any thoughts on this issue about, as individuals, what can people do if they see a film like this and decide it's something that they want to get involved in?
I think the role of civil society must be increased, and civil society must use the statistics which will be published by companies and states and compare facts in order to monitor the situation. And for this financial windfall to return to the real beneficiaries, as you said, for instance, developing countries through the establishment of essential services. We speak about the Millennium Development Goals and the results which could have been better. So I think maybe we were lacking funds, and I think that each citizen must be committed, must monitor the situation. Everybody must feel involved because we all feel the impact.
Talked a little bit, Minister, about this issue about the public attitudes to this. So I wondered if I could ask you about the point Rosa made about should we be looking at companies as separate entities in different countries, or should they be looked at in a unified way? Do you feel that the way we're going to see the race to the bottom on tax competition? Is there a need for fundamental rethink of the international tax system? Or is the kind of BEPS just closing the loopholes and going to take us far enough?
I think it's a very interesting idea as a concept. There are many economic areas of interaction between countries where there is a great deal of competition. Things you can do, things you can not do. There is a great deal of coordination, and things that are allowed, things that are not allowed. Think, for example, of trade, and that's why we have the World Trade Organization. Countries have decided also to cooperate in financial regulation. Think about the new standards that have been adopted here in Europe, including also the US in some areas. There is coordination and there is cooperation. One of the areas where there is less of that in the economic realm is fiscal matters. So this concept of what's next, should there be a single taxation to multinationals, and then the allocation of whatever you tax the multinationals among countries by a supranational authority, which is I guess, where that line of reasoning is going. Well, those are ideas that are worth discussing. Because, as I said, we've cooperated and coordinated on a number of economic areas, more in others than in fiscal policy. So it's an interesting concept to discuss. In the meantime, there is something concrete, and there is something that is, in my view, potentially very, very productive from the point of view of improving the status quo. And that is BEPS, which is essentially an agreement among countries on how to prevent the erosion of the tax base and the shifting of profits from one jurisdiction to another. If we all agree to those standards, that's a big step. It's a very important step, but that should not prevent the debate from going in the direction of greater cooperation and supranational authorities in these matters.
Thank you very much. And Pascal Saint-Amans joined us again, and I wondered if we could put the same question to him. What does he think about the long-term future of the corporate tax? Will we need to look at something way, way more ambitious even than BEPS if we're going to still have one in 10, 20 years' time?
Well, that's working. Yeah, that's a big question. What I think is happening today is we're putting an end to double non-taxation. So the schemes where actually you reduce your tax burden very significantly to almost nothing on foreign source income is coming to an end. And I hope that in the next 2 or 3 years through the implementation, this will be the reality in developed as well as developing countries. This has been an inclusive process with all the G20 countries, with a number of developing countries. I mean, Colombia, Mr. Cardenas is here to testify of that. We now have 15 developing countries in the Committee of Fiscal Affairs, and for implementation, we need to be much more inclusive. Something like a global forum on BEPS implementation would be key. But if we put an end to double non-taxation, we cannot put an end to what people call tax competition, meaning countries are free to set the rates at the level they want. What they will not be able to do is to attract profits without activities, which is a game changer. Now, it doesn't prevent a country, which is a small open economy, to reduce its tax rate. And I fear, or I feel like we'll see a number of countries reducing that tax rate. Probably the small economies will go between 10 and 20. The larger economies, because they cannot afford that lower rates, and they are much more attractive in terms of market, and so we'll probably afford between 20 and 30. We can see the UK moving down to 20%, which is probably the low end for the big countries. So in the long term, if we fix BEPS, we'll save corporate income tax, but with lower rates, which might not be that bad in terms of investment. And so, especially if you think that what matters at the end of the day is the taxation of the income in the hands of the individuals who own the companies. The companies are fictions. I mean, we're killing the real fictions, which are the sham entities in Bermuda and elsewhere. But at the end of the day, the companies are fictions. What matters is the high net worth individuals or the pension funds or retired people or the individuals who own the companies. And there I make a link with the other project, which is the end of bank secrecy. Through the end of bank secrecy, we will be able to empower governments to better tax capital income, dividends, interest, things that they had more or less given up taxing because they didn't have the information. Every time they tried to increase the marginal rate on this type of income, there was a threat to move the assets elsewhere. This is coming to an end because the governments are now, or will tomorrow, get the information. So if you look at this in a holistic manner, I think we'll save corporate income tax as a prepayment to personal income tax, and we will be in a better position to properly implement personal income tax. I may be overly optimistic, but I really hope that through coordination, this is what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you very much. And now the moment we've all been waiting for, the results of the poll. So the question of whether the BEPS initiative that Pascal's just talked about, whether it will go far enough to ensure a level playing field. The answer yes was just over 1 in 4 of you, and no was just under 3 out of 4. So sorry, Pascal, but there we go. But despite that, I think what I've picked up most from this session is actually that there is quite a mood of optimism that underpins this debate. There is, as the Minister said, awareness of these issues is crucial for things to change. And in some ways, I think the mere fact that we've got this film on what is a very, very technical issue, and people have made a really interesting 90-minute film, and lots of people have come to see it. I think that, in a sense, is a sign of how far things have changed and how much they still have to change, of course. So I think now is the opportunity to see the rest of the film. So I just want to say thank you very, very much to all the panelists for an excellent debate. And yes, it's been great having you here. Thank you.
Thank you.